Hello again, everybody, and welcome to English Expressions with Dr. Steph. Today, I wanted to talk with you about George Lamming. George Lamming is a name that anyone who's familiar with Caribbean writing would be familiar with. George Lamming hails from Barbados, and he is considered a poet, a novelist, and an essayist. He truly is someone whose work you want to look into, someone whose essays you want to read. You could perhaps consult his works in conversations. Really very interesting. He had some clear theories and ideologies in relation to the Caribbean, and his voice is definitely one that is worth hearing. He certainly believed that there should be a united Caribbean. He very often talked about perhaps putting together a university called the University of the Caribbean that really looks at the Anglophone, Hispanophone, and Francophone Caribbean and offered studies in all of these areas. He believed that we were one, even though we had very distinguished features, that we were still one united Caribbean. And so when I consider George Lamming, I wanted to look today at his work in the Castle of My Skin. Now, In the Castle of My Skin is a work I have owned from 1990 or earlier. I took this one off my bookshelf, and you will again see that it is tattered, it is worn. That's how I like my books. But if you look on the inside too, you will see quite a bit of marking. This is one that I have read and interrogated and questioned, and there are writings all over it. But that's all right, because it is worth exploring George Lamming. So George Lamming is usually recognizable by his silver afro. Sadly, Barbados and all of the Caribbean lost him in 2022. But his genius lives on, his literary contributions live on, and we want to celebrate him in this Black History Month. So In the Castle of My Skin is a Bildungsroman. What this means simply is that it tells the story of the author's development, not the author's development, the protagonist's development. And that development very often is related to a male protagonist and also is usually indicative of or reflective of the development of a nation, the development of a country. And so we see that this particular work has autobiographical elements. There are many who say this is the story of George Lamming. And when we look at George Lamming's life, he did grow up in Barbados. He was offered scholarships to study, and then he left for England. It was in the 1950s that he published this work. Let me look very quickly. It was, I believe, 1953. Yes, my memory isn't so bad. It's in 1953 that he published this work. And he has contributed several novels. He has written The Emigrants. The Castle of My Skin is the one we're looking at right now. Conversations speak more so to his essays. And there are a number of other works that we credit him. George Lamming believed that colonialism was still a factor. And so In the Castle of My Skin speaks to particular themes of colonialism, racism. It really is about change. And that change was at times positive, at times negative. Change was very often associated with what the protagonist named G, what he saw happening in his community in Barbados, his community, especially in relation to his church and his school. So there's a section here that I wanted to read. It speaks to him moving from the village school to high school and the feelings that were associated with that. It speaks to him losing friends as they went off. And let's just see what George Lamming had to say here. So we're starting on page 208 of In the Castle of My Skin, George Lamming. I experienced the feeling in a high degree when I left the village school. And in the circumstances, there was no reason to be sorry. The school was a kind of camp with an intolerable rigidity of discipline. The head teacher and all the assistants carried their canes as though they were in danger of attack from the boys, and they used them on all occasions and for all sorts of reasons. Yet the feeling was there. I was seeing the village school for the last time. The teachers shook my hand and wished me the best of luck, and I left with the intolerable feeling that they had somehow gone forever. I recalled the lampposts and the shops and the man at the corner, and I knew that the feeling was not new. That was a situation which I recalled, although I had to tell myself that the feeling was present long before I entered the high school. Later, when Trumper came to say that he was going to America, I couldn't bear to look him straight in the face. He had always dreamt of going to America, and the dream had come true. He was happy, and I was glad for him. He left on a wet morning 3 years before I left the high school. And although an important difference in our fortunes had forced us apart, I went to see him off. We stood on the pier together and watched the ship which was anchored in the distance. There were hundreds of them leaving for America, and I saw them all less real than Trumper, but with the same sickness which the feeling brought on. It seemed I wasn't going to see any of those faces again. Later, I returned to the pier and watched the big ship sweep through the night and out of sight across the sea. They were gone. Later on, he talks about entering high school, being in high school. So on page 211, there's a quick section here I want to read because, again, the focus is on change and how this is representative of colonialism. He says on page 211, at the high school, the boys never left till they were 18 or 19. Then they entered the civil service or an English university where they read for one of the professions, law or medicine. Those who didn't pass the Cambridge examinations and couldn't enter the civil service or the university were heard of 4 or 5 years after they left. They usually went to live with an aunt in New York. The doctors and the lawyers returned to practice in the island, and the civil servants seemed to remain all their life under the evergreen trees outside the public buildings. So this work talks about change. People leaving, a nation becoming disrupted, a nation finding and rebuilding itself in pretty much the same way that G, the protagonist, was finding and rebuilding himself, finding his identity. And so this is indeed autobiographical, but it is also a Bildungsroman, a reflection of what was happening with Trinidad and Barbados, and indeed with all of the Caribbean in this particular period. So George Lamming, up until the time he passed, remained quite the Caribbean genius, quite the Caribbean icon, a literary genius, someone who has contributed wholeheartedly to the development of Caribbean writings. He believed that the writer had a social responsibility to reflect the society to itself. And so he wrote, he commented, he critiqued, and he made sure to contribute and ensure too that the writers and the various artists throughout the Caribbean were contributing in worthwhile ways and improving the lot of those of us who occupy the Caribbean and indeed the African diaspora. So thank you for joining me again on English Expressions with Dr. Steph. As you know, I'm coupling my love of African clothing with my love of books for Black History Month 2024. The theme is Creative Black Expressions, and we're looking at how these artists, these creators, have changed the face of the Caribbean through what they wrote, have given people their identity, and affirmed that so much of what we thought did not make us important are indeed ideas and ideologies that have developed us over time. I look forward to seeing you next time.